Welcome to The Truth.
Yeah.
I'm John Gordon. Today, we are honored to have as our special guest Justice Douglas Ginsburg. While most of us have spent our career chasing the almighty dollar, Justice Ginsburg has dedicated himself to public service, serving his country, and a dogged pursuit of the law and the basis for our freedoms in America today. Justice Ginsburg, welcome to The Truth.
Thank you, John. I appreciate the promotion, but I'm still a judge, not yet a justice.
Well, I give you that title because of your service on the D.C. Court of Appeals, which many people
Thank
in the
you.
country would argue is the most powerful court in the land, even though they do answer to the Supreme Court. You've made some awfully weighty decisions in your time that have had a lot of implications for our country in general. But let's talk about your current passion, which is to educate younger people who are missing what you and I enjoyed as kids, which was a good lesson in civics throughout our grammar school education and middle and high school. And you're concerned, as am I, that that is missing from the public curriculum today. Before I get to that, in the name of full disclosure, I want our listeners to know that I am privileged to call Doug Ginsburg my friend, and I have tremendous admiration for him. He attended Cornell University, then the University of Chicago Law School, and then subsequently began his career after clerking for a justice of the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall, I believe, is correct.
Yeah.
Went on to teach at Harvard. So he has enjoyed a distinguished career and has been on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals since the mid 1980s. But I only say, Judge Ginsburg, that you and I are friends, so I can boast about that, but also to let people know that we are friends, and I hope to remain friends after this interview. But I will not shy away from asking you the hard questions as we go along if they present themselves.
That's a fair
Well, I know you're very
deal among
adept at
friends.
handling them, but Judge Ginsburg, tell us about the civics classes that you have done. I enjoyed watching a movie, really, where you traveled the globe, talking about America and its roots and where we began and where we've ended up today.
Well, it's a good place to start because here we are just the day before the 4th of July. And the movie you're talking about is called We Hold These Truths, but it's better known as declarationmovie.com. It's an hour long. Anyone can find it at declarationmovie.com. And it's about the influence and appeal of our Declaration of Independence all around the world. Somewhere between 100 and 120 countries have references to our Declaration in their founding documents. The most dramatic are, of all things, the Declaration of Independence of Vietnam. The day after Japan surrendered in the Second World War, Ho Chi Minh, who had studied in Paris, released his Declaration of Independence for Vietnam, and it quotes our unalienable rights verbatim. The entire thing. It's really quite remarkable. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which was drafted with Thomas Jefferson at Lafayette's elbow for the first draft, and then it went through several others, also has direct quotations, words here and there, unalienable rights, for instance, in there. And the Czechoslovakian Declaration of Independence is called the Washington Declaration. It was written in Washington by Thomas Masaryk and given to President Wilson to take to Versailles to secure Czechoslovak independence. It references our declaration, Wilson's 4 freedoms, 14 points, all of that, and directly referring to the U.S. and our declaration. So this is, I mean, country after country. There have been 4 waves of independence movements after our own. We were the first, really, our own and France's. And the Bolivarians in the 1830s, where country after country broke free from Spain, all of them referencing our declaration. At Versailles, after the First World War, when four empires were destroyed, dismembered, and scores of countries made free. After the Second World War, the decolonization period in the 40s through 60s of former colonies becoming independent countries from the United Kingdom, Spain, Portugal, Germany, Belgium, and then at the end of at the fall of the Soviet Union, where 14 other countries emerged as independent nations, and again, many and perhaps most of that group citing our Declaration of Independence. So it's had a remarkable influence. And then at home, it's had a career starting with the women's movement and their first convention at Seneca Falls, rewriting the Declaration and to say all men and women, et cetera, some other revisions to in the campaign for women's suffrage, and then by the abolitionist movement and by Frederick Douglass in particular, in his classic speech, "What to you is our 4th of July?" And then finally by Dr. Martin Luther King in his I Have a Dream speech, in which he says, "The Declaration of Independence is a promissory note long overdue." And the appeal of equality and liberty is worldwide. It's innate in people. People want liberty and are happy with equality because it's a guarantee against their being subordinated. So the influence of our declaration is really remarkable. It's quite a story. And I have to say, although a reasonably well-educated person, there's almost nothing in the movie that I knew when I started making it. I mean,
Really?
it took a couple of years of reading and writing, but it was all news to me, almost all.
Well, I learned a lot by viewing it, and it was a great education. Not only, as you have talked about, did our Constitution inspire and inform other countries in developing their own constitution, but this document has lasted 235 years, which I think would surprise even the authors of the document, were they alive today.
Oh, sure, sure. Yeah, no, the Declaration is everlasting. And the Constitution has been, I mean, we're coming up on the year after next in 26 on the 250th anniversary for the Constitution, which is pretty remarkable. It's been amended 27 times, but the first 10 were immediately adding the Bill of Rights 2 years after ratification of the Constitution, and only 17 times since then in 250 years. It's sort of once a generation that we
So
amend.
correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, the Bill of Rights were really authored after the Constitution, somewhat as an appeasement to the people that believed in states' rights and the non-federalist of the formers of the Constitution. Is that framers
The
of the Constitution?
anti-federalists, yes, yes. So what happened was that there was a debate about having a Bill of Rights at the Constitutional Convention, and the idea was defeated. The concern was that, well, two concerns. One is you could never enumerate all of the rights of a free Englishman at the time, which was what we were. And second, that any enumeration would give rise to a negative implication that if something isn't listed, it isn't a right. And so they didn't put a Bill of Rights in. And then opposition to ratifying the Constitution, because it didn't have a Bill of Rights, was so significant that it was going to go down. It needed 9 states out of 13 to ratify it, to go into effect. And it was going to go down when John Hancock was chairing the ratification convention in Massachusetts. And he said, well, let's do this. Let's ratify it subject to an understanding that a Bill of Rights will be added. That's what Massachusetts did. Several other states followed. And then it became essential to add a Bill of Rights. Madison, who had opposed having a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, was responsible for collecting suggestions from the public on what should go into a Bill of Rights. And the Anti-Federalists said, well, let's have no standing army, take that out, and cede back to the states the control over the jurisdiction over the navigable rivers, and several other things that were meant to take back some of the powers that had been reluctantly ceded to the new national government. The Articles of Confederation had been a failure. The national government couldn't tax, it couldn't raise an army. It was pathetic. And we were being abused, and our shipping was being disrupted by other countries. And so everyone knew we needed a stronger national government, but the states didn't want to cede any more power than was absolutely essential to provide an adequate national government. And so the Bill of Rights was meant to respond to that concern that we had an overreaching potentially overreaching national government. So, it's phrased one time after another: the Congress shall make no law abridging the free speech, for instance, or religion, or a jury trial, right to a jury, all of these things, limiting the Congress and therefore the federal government.
Does it concern you that there are people in our country, more significantly in our government, who appear to want to limit free speech and control certain types of speech, which has been prominently in the news the last few years, principally around the COVID vaccines and the like?
It's a concern, but it has always been a concern. Free speech is a very fragile right. And there are always people, including parts of governments, that would rather do without some speech that they find critical or unhelpful. So after ratifying the First Amendment and all the others in 1789, 1796, I think it was, and we have the first Sedition Act when John Adams succeeds Washington, so I guess it was 97 or so, and immediately gets the Congress to pass an act making it a crime to criticize the government. When Jefferson came in 1801, he freed the people the publishers who had been imprisoned because of this, and returned the money they had been fined for criticizing the government. After all, that's the most important function the free speech has in a republic. So it's always been a concern. In the early 20th century, the federal government was putting people in jail for opposing the draft. It's always a temptation for government to try to restrict speech, and it's always essential that citizens be aware of what their rights are and that they act to protect them.
So we've watched in my lifetime things ebb and flow. And after Watergate, there seemed to be a real determination to limit the power of the presidency. The Congress oftentimes is accused of gridlock. But when you look at the big picture, so many of today's most important social issues seem to have really been determined by the Supreme Court of the United States. Is that the way the framers intended it?
Well, I think it would be a surprise to them, but it started very early. When Tocqueville visited the United States and wrote his book in about 1831, he observed that almost every issue of every sort ends up being a legal issue in the United States, and increasingly later on, a constitutional issue. And that's sort of true. I mean, we have really gotten to a point where the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution, particularly in the 60s, in a way that extended its reach, the court's reach, into lots of matters that were never previously within the purview of the court. And then getting involved, of course, in abortion, which had been a state matter for forever, and then into gay marriage. I mean, the court started doing moral philosophy in lieu of law.
You have actually just read
And
my notes.
uh,
Those were the topics that I was going to ask
well,
you about.
but we've recovered from that. The court's out of the moral philosophy business and has been for a while, a little while, not long. But I hope we can keep it out of moral philosophy and stick to the Constitution.
There's one clip that came out of the Watergate hearings that for the last 50 years has really stuck with me. And it was an exchange between Herman Talmadge and the then chief of staff or uh, co-chief of staff, I guess, John Ehrlichman in the Watergate hearings. Let's roll that clip, please.
Where the line is, Senator?
Well, where is the check on the chief executive's inherent power as to where that power begins and ends? That's what I'm trying to determine.
Well, again, I would have to incorporate by reference I think, the very valuable discussion that has taken place here this morning. I couldn't add to that.
Well, you're a lawyer, and I understand you're a good one.
Well, I'm certainly not a constitutional lawyer, Senator.
Well, you remember when we were in law school, we studied a famous principle of law that came from England and also is well known in this country, that no matter how humble a man's cottage is, that even the King of England can't enter without his consent.
I'm afraid that's been considerably eroded over the years, hasn't it?
Down in my country, we still think it's a pretty legitimate principle of law.
We do see news stories about abuses of governmental authority, and such as in the cases of the FISA warrants. And tell me when I'm stepping over the line here, because I know you are a sitting judge, and I don't want to put you on the spot or ask you an inappropriate question, but are you mindful of these things? And how do we put the genie back in the bottle to the extent that government does overstep?
Well, the warrant requirement for a search has been, I guess I'd say, relaxed some with regard to vehicles, but it has certainly been maintained with regard to homes and so on. There was a terrifically interesting case that Justice Scalia wrote, in which police had used some sort of heat sensing device to determine that inside a home there must have been a lot of lights, grow lights, probably used to grow marijuana, and they knocked on the door and entered the house, or were admitted to the house, but they did this without a warrant. And Scalia said, "Look, the technology can change, but the principle is the same, and the king cannot enter your home without a warrant, and you cannot get a warrant without probable cause shown to a judge or a magistrate to sign that warrant." I had a case a few years ago in which the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington they got a search warrant. They executed it after it had expired, and in the state of Maryland, not in the District of Columbia. And of course, we know that they could not do that. I mean, the fact they'd gotten a search warrant once didn't mean they were authorized forever to track somebody and then arrest them in another state. So, the search warrant requirement is pretty secure. Now, the FISA court, operates in under a secrecy,
A different
in a
realm.
secret environment, and it's proved to be susceptible to abuse by an executive officer that simply lies to the court. And now that's come to light that that's what happened, and I don't know what safeguards there are against it happening again, but it's a pretty extreme matter when the executive branch just lies to a court.
So
That's intolerable.
Judges are people as well, and we're all wired similarly but different. And it seems like politics seems to highlight our differences the most in many contexts. How do you, as a jurist, leave your own biases at the door to your courtroom? How do judges separate their own bias from the facts and the law of a case. And do you think that it works?
I do. I've served with about 35 other judges over the last 37 years that I've been on the court. And I find that even a new judge very quickly puts aside personal preferences and experiences, partly because we sit in threes. So that's unlike a district judge who tries a case individually. So we sit in threes. We have to discuss things. If somebody's not being reasonable, if they don't really have a good legal argument, it would be embarrassing, frankly, for them. So they have to have a principled argument in order to vote one way or another on the case. I think for a district court, it's probably more challenging because each of the judges is out there alone, expected to be unbiased and to come up with evidentiary rulings without stopping the proceedings and going and doing research to do things based on experience. So I think that's probably more challenging, but I think we're doing a very good job, and at least in the federal judiciary. And I talk to district court judges a lot because I do a lot of teaching of other judges, and they will uniformly tell you that juries do an excellent job, that there's rarely an occasion when they disagree with the jury's verdict, very rarely.
Well, that's very reassuring to hear.
It
and
is.
I think the American
it
people,
is.
I think the American people really need to hear and get that message, because certainly in these days and times, the mainstream media put out stories that don't lead you to that conclusion necessarily. And so I'm comforted
Now,
by
but bear in
your
mind,
words.
John, bear in mind that 95% plus, I think it's maybe 97% of all cases are heard in state courts, not in federal court. And the state courts clearly vary a good deal in how they choose their judges, what kind of protections they have against political influence. In many states, the judges are elected, and that can be a very partisan matter, as it was when I grew up in Cook County, Illinois, Chicago. The judges were all, party partisan followers of Mayor Daley's Cook County Democratic machine. That was not healthy.
And that is an interesting point in itself. The Constitution does not create, to my understanding, political parties. Where did they come from? How did we end up with them? And, there are times that I seriously question whether the party is a good thing for our country and our system of government. Just my own little editorial. It seems that the fringe groups of both parties cause a tremendous amount of angst, and it deprives us of a healthy middle ground because, as Richard Nixon said, that's the great silent majority. Where did the parties come from, and are they serving a valid purpose in today's system of governance?
Well, the framers of the Constitution, and most prominently Madison, the principal draftsman, were appalled by parties. They called them factions. They didn't want factions to enter into the legislature. But almost immediately, the people elected to the Congress grouped themselves into parties, into the Democrat Party and the Democrat Republicans. I mean, they emerged very quickly. The Federalists first, and then the Democrats. So the Federalists were the parties of Washington and Adams. Jefferson was a Democratic Republican, they called it, I believe. And these were big government versus small government parties, more urban versus more rural, really paving the way for what persisted for a very long time. Now, with a two-party system, and we inherited this because of the first past the post. If you're going to win a constituency with the majority of the votes, instead of having multi-party system with proportional representation, which is very fragile. You know, Italy's had almost 70 governments just since World War II. But if you have first past the post, you're going to end up with two parties almost all the time. And historically, they have found it necessary to reach to the middle. So before the realignment that began to occur under President Nixon, there were very conservative Democrats in the South, Herman Talmadge being an example, your senator, and very liberal Democrats in the North. It was a big tent party.
We called that group Dixiecrats back in the day.
Yeah,
of Herman Talmadge and Richard Russell and John Stennis and the
that's
Southern
right,
contingent.
Eastland. The Republicans were likewise a big tent with more conservatives and many liberals also, or what we would today call moderates probably. So this extension of the two fringes of the parties into the progressive wing of the Democrat Party and the ultra-conservative wing of the Republican Party in the Congress is a relatively new thing, and it has destroyed the way in which we've managed to stumble along over these 250 years and made it very difficult to legislate.
Well, I had a conversation with my friend who is a pastor in one of Atlanta's largest African-American churches, who I go to when I'm having a really rough day and I need a shoulder to lean on and looking for spiritual divine intervention. And I said to him that I felt like that in our country, that selfishness had become a value that we didn't used to see, and that this zero-sum game in politics seemed to be created out of lust for power and greed of getting one's own way. And as a younger person, I always marveled that there seemed to be a fair amount of restraint, and that there was it appeared to be a lot of give and take and compromise. Do you share my perception that value has been lost and that we're too polarized?
Well, I do share that, but I must say, I think, like as the framers thought, human nature doesn't change.
That's right.
People aren't greedier now than they used to be, or what have you. The institutions around them have changed in a way that tolerates or even facilitates that kind of conduct. And so we've seen a lot of institutional change. The party chairman in both parties in the Congress have lost a great deal of power, which has been taken over by the leadership of the two parties. So whoever is in the majority really confines their legislative activity to a small group surrounding the leader. And so you have party chairmen who don't have the influence that they used to have, and that's had some moderating effect right there. And we have every member now being a sort of an entrepreneur out in order to get personal funding rather than raise money for the party, for instance, but primarily to get personal funding for re-election. The cost of elections has gone up so much that gets much more exaggerated than it used to be. I think being a member of the House of Representatives for most members must be a really lousy job. I mean, having to maintain two places to live and constantly having to raise money and very short electoral cycle. So I think that might not attract some of the caliber of the people that we used to get in Congress. So I can't test that hypothesis, but I would think that it's become less. I know it's become less attractive, and I would think that means that it's not attracting as many good people.
We're talking to Judge Douglas Ginsburg. He is a member of the DC Circuit Court of Appeals and has been a jurist for over 30 years and has been a public servant even longer. And we're coming to you today on the John Fredericks Media Network across that platform in Atlanta, Nashville, Memphis, Richmond, Norfolk, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh. So welcome to all of our listeners. We are also coming to you live as we do each week on Rumble, Getter, and YouTube Live. Judge Ginsburg, I want you to tell us, where do we find your civics lessons? I know that we're recording this, as you alluded to a moment ago, the day before the 4th of July. So I think it's really, the timing is wonderful that we're having this conversation. And where do we find the movie, and where do we find the civics classes?
Sure. So the movie, again, is easily, it's on the web at declarationmovie.com. And that's about our Declaration of Independence. Now, that is a prequel. Then there's a 3-hour series on the Constitution called A More or Less Perfect Union. And that came out in 20 in January. And then in March, COVID came, and PBS almost immediately, very quickly, created something called PBS at Home from 1 to 5. And it was for all of the millions, tens of millions of children who were out of school because of COVID. And the stations around the country played A More or Less Perfect Union many, many times. I mean, it got a great deal of airplay. It was very popular. And it's evergreen. I mean, nothing's changed in the last few years about our Constitution. So I commend that to you, to your listeners, A More or Less Perfect Union. Now, on civics directly, because of COVID, when I couldn't be out filming, I created something called Civics Fundamentals, and it's available at civicsfundamentals.org. I took the naturalization exam. You know, to become a citizen of the United States, you have to pass an exam that has 100 questions. And it's possible to pass that exam, I'm sorry to say, without learning anything, just memorizing answers. What is George Washington famous for? And there are 5 correct answers. Name a U.S. territory. Again, 5 correct answers. You don't really have to learn anything in order to parrot back those answers. So, the answers to those questions. But in 3 minutes, 2.5 to 3 minutes, I made 100 videos. And in 2.5 to 3 minutes, I can actually make it interesting and explain why things are the way they are. Why do we have five territories? What is a territory? How is it different from a state? Why do we acquire each one of these? So you actually learn something, and it's memorable. It's not talking heads. It's animations, reenactments, file footage, ancient photos, all of that. So it moves right along. And it's gamified. So people and students in middle school and high school get badges and so on. They really like to play with it. And that's civicsfundamentals.org. And it's free on the web. Everything is free. It can be used by people who want to become citizens, but it's being used by students in about 8 or 9 states right now, where we have met with the departments of education, and they have recommended or put it on a list of recommended materials for teachers to use to teach civics.
So what inspired you to do that? What was the reason that you've invested your time and energy?
Because we have a terrible situation in our country where the voting population is more ignorant than it has ever been. The elimination of civics education in middle and high school, it began going downhill. We have data from 1972 forward. And the number of classes being offered, the number of students who have civics goes down and down and down. And then in 2001, when No Child Left Behind came in, there was money for school districts to improve their scores in math and reading. And so music and civics and art all went out the window. So it's been a real struggle to try to get it back in, but there is a reaction now. There are lots of groups out there trying to get their local schools to reinstitute some real civics instruction. Ask a recent graduate from high school a simple question. I've been told when I asked who was the first president of the United States, I was told Abraham Lincoln. I mean, this is terrible because these people vote. They're eligible to vote at 18. They are completely not obviously, it varies. There are some very good public school systems, but most of them do not have much civics. So they don't know their rights. They don't know their responsibilities. They don't know their history. They are not patriotic because they don't know their history. And they're assaulted constantly particularly in colleges if they go there, but even below that, in all the reasons that this is a terrible country and all the terrible people who live here and oppress everyone else. I mean,
Well, that's
it's
the thing that
absurd.
boggles the mind. And, I truly do believe that we live in the greatest country on earth. We're not perfect. There's a lot of room for improvement, but it must be pretty special because a lot of people seem to want to come here and stay here as they flee worse conditions. And
Yeah.
I know that one of the authors of the Constitution, um, I believe was it Benjamin Franklin that said that uh, he's given us a republic if we can keep it.
Yes, yes, exactly his words. A republic if you can keep it.
And I think it's worth fighting for to keep it. And you're certainly doing your part
Well,
philanthropically, I'm
generation,
sure.
generation after generation have fought to keep it, but I don't know that the current generation would.
Well, and I think the lack of civics training, as you pointed out, it results in unintended consequences. One of which is a diminution in our patriotism, and I certainly consider myself to be a compassionate individual, and I feel for people that have grievances that they feel that they need to air, but taking a knee during the playing of the national anthem and a salute to our flag is an inappropriate means of doing that to me, even though I acknowledge their right to free speech.
Yes, of course. Well, that's symbolic, but here's a practical and manifestation of the same thing. Our military services are not meeting their recruitment goals. 25% shortfall this year for the Army. This is tragic. I mean, we have an all-volunteer Army. It's a wonderful thing, but we've never been short of volunteers until recently.
Well, I know when I was a kid that my dad had been in the Army during World War II. He was a lieutenant, and my friends and I used to play dress up, and I would wear his Army hat. And somehow that infused in me a deep sense of patriotism because I heard the stories and I met his friends who were in the Army with him in World War II. Our generation, or our children's generation, seems to have lost that connection, I'm afraid. And that's probably a whole nother conversation. My own sense is that we've worked so hard to try and create better lives for our children that we've actually sheltered them. I had an interview with Secretary of Commerce Ross just 2 weeks ago, and he defined it as a generation of heightened sensitivity who do not want to experience adversity, and that's just not the real laws of nature or the way that it works.
Well, it's true. And in schools, they've been given trigger warnings and all sorts of insulation from the need to meet an argument and make an argument. It's a lost skill, and that's tragic because we can't have a national dialogue if people don't know how to participate. If all they can do is curse each other or occupy buildings instead of being able to articulate an actual argument that withstands a counter argument, we're sunk.
Judge Ginsburg, thank you so much for coming on The Truth Today with us and giving us this free history lesson in civics. I have found it fascinating. I have watched the movie. I am going to go watch the 2 and 3 minute clips, which is more suited to my attention span. And I really look forward to continuing to expand my knowledge on our civics in the United States.
Well, thank you, John. It's really always great talking to you. And I hope we'll be getting together again soon, just as friends.
Well, I look forward to that, and my best to DC, who I know is also very active in trying to improve the educational system in America today and spends a lot of her free time doing just that. So you all are certainly two of my American heroes, and thank you for everything that you've done for our country.
And my best regards to Helen.
Thank you. Have a wonderful 4th of July. And that is The Truth. I'm John Gordon.